Member for Berthier-Masquis-Longet. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I was rather flummoxed by this speech from a colleague who usually makes sense. He just said that the members of the Bloc don't care for seniors. That's probably why we're trying to table this motion. Maybe that's why we've been fighting for 5 years, so that his government finally acts in an equitable way for all seniors. We're ready to enter an election. Is he ready for an election on seniors? The Honourable Member for King's Hants. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable colleague. But the voting record is eminently clear. This member and the other members of the Bloc Québécois voted against dental care for seniors. They voted against lowering the retirement age, and they voted against strengthening the GIS. So, yes, thank you very much for playing the game, but it's too late for the Bloc Québécois. And we'll move to answers after question period. 4 minutes remain.
Statements by members. Déclaration des députés. The honourable member for Bonavista, Buren, Trinity.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to acknowledge a group of 7 harvesters from my riding who went to work at sea this past July and endured a terrifying experience. Their boat, the Elite Navigator, did not arrive back home, and as expected, this set off a massive search effort headed by the Canadian Coast Guard. 51 hours later, and just after the crew had used their last emergency flare, rescuers were able to locate them. Thankfully, all the men were healthy and otherwise uninjured. Transported home by the Coast Guard, they were greeted to a hero's welcome in Newest Valley by hundreds of people. The story speaks to the importance of the Coast Guard, and I am proud of the investments our government has made to new lifeboat stations around the coastline of Newfoundland and Labrador to monitor and support mariners in distress. Mr. Speaker, I want to express my appreciation to all involved in this search and rescue mission, and my relief that these lucky 7 men are back home. Welcome home, boys.
Good job. The honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Mr. Speaker, it was an immense honour to spend time with and present the King Charles III Coronation Medals to 2 extraordinary Canadian Forces veterans from Kamloops who played pivotal roles in D-Day efforts. Zach Bork, a 101-year-old Royal Canadian Air Force veteran, served with unwavering dedication as a supply technician, defending Britain's coast during these critical moments. His courage and commitment during D-Day are nothing short of inspiring. I also had the profound privilege of awarding the same coronation medal to John Kaharski, a 104-year-old veteran who bravely stormed the shores of Juno Beach during the D-Day invention. He even can recount that day in great detail at 104 years of age. To Zach and John, I extend my deepest gratitude. Your incredible service and sacrifice has helped preserve the values and freedoms that define our great Canadian way of life. You are true heroes. We are forever indebted to you. Thank you for your service.
The honourable member for Longueuil, Charlemagne.
To pay tribute today to an exceptional citizen of Longueuil-Charlemagne and someone I'm proud to call a friend. Dan Lamoureux first joined Riverside School Board 26 years ago, serving as chair of its Council of Commissioners for the last decade. During his tenure, he was instrumental in making Riverside one of the highest performing school boards in Quebec with a graduation rate of 88.5%. Dan was previously president of the Quebec English School Board Association, where he played a key role in ensuring the survival of Quebec's English language school boards. Demonstrating a lifetime of service, Dan was a firefighter for the City of Westmount, a frequent volunteer in Greenfield Park, and a strong advocate for the English language community in Quebec, serving as president of the QCGN. As he begins a well-deserved retirement, I'm sure he's looking forward to spending more time with his sons and grandsons and his wife, Joanne, who I'm sure already has a list of projects for him to do. Dan, I'm sorry I can't be at your retirement party this evening, but I wanted to recognize your incredible contributions and wish you all the best. Thank you.
The honourable member for, excuse me, if we could please quiet down, it would be good to hear the statements by members.
so we can have some silence, so we can hear the presentations from our members. And to that point, I'll probably re-ask the honourable member for Kamloops Thompson Carberry to redo his in a few moments.
The honourable member for Therese-Blainville. Today, we have the great pleasure of welcoming 40 young students from the St. Therese Academy Student Council, which is in my riding. This is the 13th Student Council, and the members here are very active in introducing young people to political life by sparking debate on social and political issues and by proposing projects and activities for and by these young Academy members. I would like to salute their commitment, as well as that of their teachers and the school authorities. Parliamentarian work is not always easy, but is essential and extremely stimulating. It is a privilege to serve the people who elected us, and it is an equal privilege to welcome you here today. Have a good term. The honourable member for Sudbury.
October 1st is recognized as Seniors' Day in Canada and all around the world. Today we celebrate seniors across our country and acknowledge the significant contributions they have made to our families, our communities, and society at large. From fighting for our freedoms to building the railroad, highways, schools, and hospitals, from creating vibrant community centres and gathering places, seniors have helped build the great country Canada is today. This National Seniors Day, I would especially like to acknowledge the formation of the Canadian Senior Living Association. CSLA is a group of provincial associations across the country advocating for seniors' issues on a national scale. Congratulations to the Canadian Senior Living Association on its launch, and happy National Seniors Day to our seniors. Thank you for all that you have done and continue to do.
The honourable member for Red Deer Lacombe.
I rise today to honour the life of Hugh Michael Green. Hugh immigrated to Alberta with his family in 1928. A centenarian, he was 101 years old at the time of his passing. A living definition of a gentleman, he loved his family, community, and country and brought honour to all his deeds. After graduating from Wetaskiwin High School, he joined the RCAF, where he served in England and Germany until 1946. When he returned home from the Air Force, he married the love of his life, Doris. They called Ponoka their home for more than 65 years. Together they raised 5 children, had 5 grandchildren, and 9 great-grandchildren. And I'm so glad that Hugh and Doris were able to recently celebrate their 75th wedding anniversary. He was remembered in the Ponoka community as one of the last veterans of the Second World War. He was the embodiment of Canada's greatest generation. The Royal Canadian Legions across our country recently put their flags at half-mast to honour Hugh, who once served as the Legion's Dominion President. On behalf of a grateful community and a nation, thank you, Hugh, for a life well lived. Rest in peace, my friend.
And I'll recall on the honourable member for Kamloops Thompson Carberry to redo his presentation.
Mr. Speaker, it was an immense honour to spend time with and present the King Charles III Coronation Medals to 2 extraordinary Canadian Forces veterans who played invaluable roles on D-Day efforts. Zach Bork, a 101-year-old Royal Canadian Air Force veteran from Kamloops, served with unwavering dedication as a supply technician, defending Britain's coast during those critical moments. His courage and commitment during D-Day were nothing short of inspiring. I also had the profound privilege of awarding the same coronation medal to 104-year-old John Kaharski, a veteran who bravely stormed the shores of Juno Beach during the D-Day invasion. He can even recount those details with tremendous clarity. To Zach and John, I expend my deepest gratitude. Your incredible service and sacrifice have helped preserve the values and freedoms that define our great nation. We are indebted to you. Thank you for your service.
The honourable member for Richmond Hill.
Mr. Speaker, today we reflect on the significance of both Truth and Reconciliation Day and Senior Day, honoring the profound history and contribution that shape our Canadian identity. Yesterday, we reflected on the resilience and contribution of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people and organizations in Richmond Hill, such as Odwin. I speak with sincere gratitude for their important work on an Indigenous-led non-for-profit providing vital employment and education program across York Region. And as we celebrate National Senior Day today, I recognize leaders including Montchalm Foundation, Caribbean North Charities Foundation, among others. They're crucial in the helping seniors in my riding age well at home, stay informed and connected, and live with dignity and security. In recognizing both days, we embrace the lessons of our past while fostering compassion and unity in the present. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Vaudreuil-Soulanges. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to commend the Vaudreuil-Soulanges Chamber of Commerce on its 30th anniversary. For the past 3 decades, this vital organization has been an important resource for our business community by helping stimulate economic growth, innovation, and collaboration in our region. Whether it be by helping business people network or stimulating local development, the Chamber has played a key role in transforming Vaudreuil-Soulanges' economic landscape. Its dedication and diligent work have created a number of opportunities that have helped our small businesses grow. We are celebrating this important step, and I would like to recognize the exceptional leadership of the staff, members, and partners of the Chamber. And I hope that the next 30 years are just as prosperous and successful. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from King Aurora. King Vaughan, forgive me.
After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, taxes are up, costs are up, crime is up, time is up. Mr. Speaker, today is Seniors Day, and it is an honour to serve as the Shadow Minister for Seniors. Seniors have dedicated their lives to the prosperity of this country. They have made incredible sacrifices in order to provide for their families and plan for the future. Seniors should be able to retire on their savings and enjoy their golden years in peace and financial security. Seniors' retirement income is simply not keeping up with the pace of the cost of living crisis. The continuous increase of the carbon tax affects the price of groceries, gas, and home heating. This is the reckless record of this NDP Liberal government on seniors. Conservatives will promote financial securities, create policies that do not penalize seniors, and that encourage meaningful connections for our valued seniors. It's time for a carbon tax election so Canadians can decide.
The Honourable Member for Aurora Oak Ridges, Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is National Seniors Day. Seniors, older Canadians, elders, lived and contributed to our country for 50, 60, or even 100 years. Yesterday, the Day for Truth and Reconciliation, I saw the great respect Indigenous communities accord their elders, one of many Indigenous practices that would lead to the betterment of our society. I'd like to recognize some of our local organizations that support seniors. Chats, Crescent Village, Richmond Hill and Elgin West Seniors Club, Aurora Seniors, the Italian Talon Indian Seniors Clubs, Moncton, and Seniors for Climate Change, who are demonstrating right now. Our government's support for seniors is solid and enduring. OAS, GIS, dental care, farmer care, the caregiver credit, aging in place. We will never put a singular ideological focus on a balanced budget ahead of support for older Canadians, who have not only helped build Canada, but continue to make Canada the best country on earth. To my 89-year-old parents and all seniors across Canada, thank you and happy Seniors Day.
Look at the taxpayer gold she's wearing. Look at all that gold on her neck.
The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lobinière. Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives, just like thousands of Canadians and Quebecers, have lost trust in this Prime Minister and are fearing this opportunistic bloc party. The NDP has kept the government on life support for months, and now the fickle bloc is hypocritically trying to string the government along until October 29th. The Bloc Québécois does not care about Quebecers. It just wants to save this centralizing and costly Prime Minister. They want to keep him in power, whereas he is constantly encroaching on provincial jurisdiction. With regard to woodland caribou, The Liberals are unscrupulously going to jeopardize 1,400 jobs with their decree, and the Bloc has been powerless in trying to undo this decree. The only party that is working to save the forestry sector is us, the Conservative Party. The Bloc can boast the worst negotiator in history, and the fact that it doesn't care about the Quebec nation, it's just ready to sell its soul instead of offering Canadians the country they deserve. Will the Bloc vote to...
The honourable member from Bay of Quinte.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years, taxes are up, costs are up, crime's up, and time's up. And Canadians are finding the dream of Canada shattered. A country where you could once find a good job, buy a home in a safe neighbourhood, afford groceries, access reliable health care, and pay fair taxes is slipping away. This Liberal NDP government's reckless spending and socialist agenda have committed economic vandalism. GDP per capita is down. Unemployment rates, especially for our youth, are up. Household debt is up and taxes are up. All this when Canada, under these Liberals, starts at third base and they act like they're hitting a triple. We need a rich talent. We have the talent, the resources. We should be hitting a home run. Canada is mirrored in economic vandalism, but common sense will lead us home. We will cap spending, axe Texas, reward work, build homes, uphold families, stop crime, secure borders, rearm our forces, restore our freedom, and unite our people. Canada, let's hit a home run and bring it home!
The Honourable Member for Notre-Dame-de-Grâce, Westmount.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Today to highlight the transformational impact of the Canadian Dental Care Plan, which has already benefited over 750,000 Canadians, including over 5,000 residents of Notre-Dame-de-Grâce, Westmount. And that number continues to rise. This initiative has made essential dental services accessible, reducing the financial burden on families and promoting better oral health.
This plan goes further than just meeting immediate dental needs. It also encourages preventive care, which will allow our fellow citizens to keep their smile for years to come. Let's continue to support and develop this essential program by strengthening our commitment to health and welfare for all Canadians. Thank you.
Another MP who's going to lose her seat.
The honourable member from Esquimalt, Saanich,
Most of Quebec's either going to go
Speaker,
Bloc or
I rise to
Conservative
mark
next
1 year
election.
since October 7th attacks on Israel. This was the single deadliest day Jewish people have faced since the Holocaust, and it forever changed their world. On October 7th, Hamas terrorists took 251 civilians hostage while killing over 1,200 people, including 8 Canadians. Judy Weinstein, Vivian Silver, Ben Mizrahi, Neda Epstein, Shir Georgi, Adi Vital Kaploun, Alexander Locke, and Tiferet Lapido. May their memories be a blessing. In the years since, Jewish Canadians have faced an alarming rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes, with vandalism, bomb threats, and open calls for violence against Jews. Jewish Canadians wearing a Magen David or yarmulke in public or placing a mezuzah outside their homes face harassment and threats to their safety, all with the added stress of ongoing deadly rocket attacks targeting friends and family in Israel. Jewish Canadians are calling for action. We know all too well the dire consequences of turning a blind eye to anti-Semitism. It is time to work together to demand the return of all hostages and to chart a path toward a just and lasting negotiated peace for all.
The Honourable Member for Shefford. What a happy coincidence. The Bloc Québécois Opposition Day, calling for a royal recommendation for Bill C-319, falls today on October 1st, the International Day of Older People. This bill seeks to make everything fair for all seniors. And with inflation, we must recognize those who have fixed incomes and that are directly impacted and need a hike in their OAS. We have to not leave them in a state of financial vulnerability because poverty does not wait for the age of 75. And those who wish to remain on the labor market should be able to do so without being penalized. Let us recognize their diversity, but also let us think about their place in society. We owe them respect because they are the ones who have forged Quebec. So let's take a day to realize the richness that they bring us. It is our duty to treat them with respect and to ensure that their social safety net allows them to age in dignity.
The honourable member from Calgary, Rocky Ridge.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of NDP Liberals, taxes are up, costs are up, crime is up, and time's up. This Prime Minister's economic vandalism is making Canadians poorer with every passing year. Per capita GDP is lower than it was 9 years ago and shrinking. Since 2015, Canada has had the worst per capita GDP in the G7. We're down 2%, while the U.S. is up 8%. That's what 9 years of capital flight looks like. We have abundant land and resources and great workers, but Canada no longer has the tools and the technology to compete because of capital flight. Since 2015, $500 billion has shifted from Canada to the United States, especially in the energy industry. Investments are leaving Canada to create high-paying jobs, building mines, factories, pipelines, and houses in the United States. From 2001 to 2014, it was Canada that won the investment tug-of-war with the U.S. That's why we need a Conservative government now to clean up this government's economic vandalism and make up for 9 lost years.
Hear, hear. The honourable member from Mount Royal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow night is the beginning of the Jewish New Year. Normally, this is a festive time, one of joy and celebration. But this year, there is a shadow. The last year has been an annus horribilis for Jews. Next week is the anniversary of October the 7th, a day Hamas attacked Israel, slaughtered over 1,200 people, and kidnapped hundreds of others. Then a wave of anti-Semitism swept across the world. People here at home telling Jews to go back to Poland, firing shots into our schools, yelling hateful slogans outside our community buildings, setting up encampments on university campuses, and attacking our support for Israel. I pray that this new year is a better one. I pray for a world where Israel can defend itself from Iranian and Hezbollah missiles without being condemned, and one where it can live securely in peace with its neighbors. And I pray for a Canada where Jewish Canadians can feel safe again, as all governments take real action to confront anti-Semitism.
Okay, let's get to question period now. Pierre's in the House, Freeland's in the House. There we go, QP time.
Chers collègues, j'ai l'honneur.
Colleagues, I have the honor of informing this House that the clerk has received from the Chief Electoral Officer notice of the election of Mr. Sauvé in the riding of La Salle et Mar-Verdun.
Oh, we got to welcome in the by-election MPs. Gotcha. So this is the block one. They took a Liberal seat, if I'm not mistaken. I wonder if we have the other by-election MP here to welcome in. I think it was NDP that won that one. Yeah, we do. There's Alistair back there, so they're gonna... Oh, what's his name? McGregor? Something? What's his name? I don't know if his first name is Alistair. First name.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honor to introduce Mr. Louis-Philippe Sauvé, member for the riding of La Salle et Mar-Verdun, who swore an oath before the registry and now is asking for the right to sit here. I invite the honourable member to take a seat.
This is ridiculous. I thought that too. Why is he wearing jeans? It looks bad when you're wearing a suit at the top and then you wear jeans on the bottom. That's just weird.
I would like to note that since we have returned from our summer recess, there have been a number of questions and comments that have gone beyond the bounds in this House.
In question period to only let the person who is speaking to ask the question and the person responding to respond, and to slow down your heckling. Oral questions. Questions,
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this Liberal bloc, they have doubled the debt, increased taxes. After these 9 years, seniors are struggling to pay the bills. Record numbers of seniors have to go to food banks to eat. They're struggling to pay rent since the cost of housing has doubled. Their children and grandchildren can't buy a home like they would have been able to in other times. Will the government accept our common sense plan? We want to fix the budget and axe the tax so that our seniors can pay their bills with dignity. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Here goes Squeak House.
Mr. Speaker, seniors in Canada remember very well what Conservative policy for seniors were. They remember that in Davos, Prime Minister Harper announced that he would increase the retirement age from 65 to 67. As for grandchildren, seniors support our national daycare program for their grandchildren. We will work for them and for their grandchildren. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker, the Bloc Québécois leader keeps picking fights and squabbling with the government of Quebec. Instead, he should be defending the nation of Quebec. But rather than doing so, he says he's happy that the forestry sector is under threat. Quebec's Environment Minister said the opposite, though. He said, I would like the Bloc Québécois to defend us more strongly than they are currently. Will the Prime Minister listen to those who really truly have common sense and permanently reverse this decree? The Honourable Public Services and Procurement Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Conservative leader talks about squabbles. Well, he's picked a fight with each and every single municipality in Quebec. He's called mayors incompetent. Will he finally apologize for calling municipalities, their employees, incompetent? When he was Minister of Housing, he built a grand total of 6 housing units. The Honourable Member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. I would ask you to please leave the floor to those who are recognized by the chair. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Carbon tax Carney became conflict of interest Carney when the Prime Minister named him to be effectively the phantom finance minister to advise on economic policy while he presides over a massive multi-billion-dollar multinational corporation that sought 10 billion Canadian tax dollars to take over our pension system. He's got a $2 billion loan for a friend, and now we learn that the economic task force he heads up has only one person. Isn't he a walking, talking conflict of interest?
Yeah.
So true.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we are glad to get economic advice from smart former Canadian central bankers like Mark Carney and like Steve Pelosi, who is doing some great work advising us on how to encourage Canadian pension funds to invest more in Canada. Meanwhile, Mr. Speaker, on that side of the House, they get their foreign policy advice from Elon Musk and from Tucker Carlson. They should be ashamed of themselves. The people of Ukraine certainly know what's going on.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
She really doesn't like Elon Musk.
Speaker, today the Premier, Mr. Speaker, today the very courageous and common sense Premier of New Brunswick launched a renewed lawsuit against the quadrupling carbon tax. He's pointing out that this carbon tax will force the layoff of nurses, doctors, and teachers because of the extra cost it imposes on operating schools and hospitals. Instead of requiring courts to decide on the quadrupling carbon tax, why won't the Prime Minister let the people decide in a carbon tax election?
Here.
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
I am so glad that the Leader of the Opposition gives me an opportunity to talk about the price on pollution, because we made a great announcement just a few minutes ago, and that is that small businesses in the province of New Brunswick that he was talking about that have 499 employees are going to get rebates of $43,413. In the province of Ontario that we both represent, a business of 499 employees can get a rebate of nearly $300,000. They're going to get that money directly in their bank accounts by the end of the year.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Almost a year ago today, Tehran-backed terrorists unleashed the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. Ever since, they've continued to push this genocidal aim. Today, hundreds of rockets came from Tehran towards Israel, forcing millions into shelter. 2 terrorist attacks carried out. This Prime Minister has talked out of both sides of his mouth, saying one thing to one group, the opposite to another. Will the Prime Minister state clearly that Israel has the right to defend itself by defeating Hezbollah, Hamas, the IRGC, and all the other terrorists?
The Honourable Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, we all seen the attacks by Iran against Israel today, and of course we condemn them unequivocally. These attacks from Iran will only serve to further escalate the region. And therefore, that is why I've been in contact with my Israeli counterpart this morning, and I've been in contact with many G7 foreign ministers as well as Arab countries' foreign ministers. This is a very dangerous time for the Middle East, and we need to make sure that this war stops. Thank you.
And I ask the Honourable Member from St. Albert, Edmonton, please, to only take the floor when he is recognized to do so. L'honorable député de La Prairie.
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. If the Liberals don't want an election now, then they have to support all seniors equally and fairly. That's why seniors advocacy groups are here today on the Hill. The FADOC and its Mauricie branch, the AQDR, the Outaouais AQRP and AREQ, the Table de Concertation des Aînés des Laurentides, they're all here today to ask the federal government to stop having 2 classes of seniors. They're here to demand a 10% increase in OAS for those 74 and under. Will the government finally listen to them?
I think that guy's running for the leader of the bloc.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Seniors.
Talks more than the bloc leader does.
Mr. Speaker, we're shocked by what the Bloc Québécois is saying. Because what did they vote against? They voted against dental care, which is currently saving hundreds of dollars for hundreds of thousands of Quebecers and Canadians. We're shocked that the Bloc Québécois voted against the guaranteed income supplement and its increase. The GIS helps the least well-off seniors, Mr. Speaker. The Bloc Québécois is so hypocritical, and we are shocked. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. It is the International Day of Older Persons today. So suffice it to say that today's not the best day to avoid answering seniors' questions about OAS, especially not when seniors' representatives are here watching us. So we're going to give the Liberals another chance. They have until October 29th to stop depriving people aged 74 and under of 10% of their OAS. International Seniors Day would be the best possible day to announce that the Liberals are finally going to do it. So, will the Liberals give royal recommendation to C319, yes or no? The Honourable Minister of Labour and Seniors. Well, Mr. Speaker, I would like to wish everyone happy International Seniors Day, especially representatives of the Outaouais REC. Mr. Speaker, the member for La Prairie rises daily, but doesn't seem to remember that when it came time to vote to increase, that is, to decrease the retirement age to 65. What did the member for La Prairie do? He, in fact, voted against it. He wanted to keep the retirement age.
From Nunavut.
Another injustice, another day in court for the Liberals. 2 Ontario First Nations are suing this government for their discriminatory underfunding of fire services in their communities. With climate change and aging infrastructure, First Nations are at higher risks. Instead of wasting more time in court, will the Liberals stop the discrimination against First Nations, truly commit to reconciliation, and deliver the funding needed to save lives?
The Honourable Minister for Indigenous Services.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite is right. We all have to do more to protect the lives of Indigenous people, in particular First Nations children, who are many times more likely to die in a house fire than their non-Indigenous counterparts. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we've invested over $136 million for First Nations self-determined projects to reduce the risks of fire, including making homes safer and ensuring equipment is available and working.
The Honourable Member from Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Indigenous people have a right to culturally informed community health care when they need it. But because of failed healthcare policies under the Liberal and Conservative governments, nearly 10 years since the release of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, healthcare gaps for Indigenous people have widened. So, Mr. Speaker, why won't the Prime Minister listen to Indigenous experts and leadership and design a healthcare system that ensures access to this basic human right?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Minister for Indigenous Services.
Mr. Speaker, in fact, that's exactly what this government has done. In fact, with the renewed health transfers, separate money, $2 billion dedicated to First Nations leaders who are working on health transformation, self-determined health care services across this country. And on top of that, Mr. Speaker, another 10 years of funding for the First Nations Health Authority to continue to plan and deliver health services for First Nations people in BC. We will get this work done together, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to quote one of the world's most credible news organizations on financial and economic matters. The Financial Times of London, May 10th, 2024. The headline: Breakdown nations like Canada have a lesson for the world. Canada leads nations which have suffered a sharp decline in per capita GDP. Simple question. Does the government agree that Canada leads nations that have suffered a sharp decline in per capita GDP?
Wow. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
What the government agrees with is that Canada was the first G7 country to lower interest rates for the first time. Canada was the first G7 country to lower interest rates for a second time, and Canada was the first G7 country to lower interest rates for a third time. The government also knows that wages in Canada have outpaced inflation for 19 months in a row. And meanwhile, inflation, 2% in August, has been within the Bank of Canada's target range.
Yeah, cut her off. Cut her off.
Again, I'm going to invite members, please, not to take the floor unless they're being invited to by the chair. The Honourable Member from Halton Hills, Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, the Bank of Canada has become the first central bank to cut rates because Canada has become the first leading economy to go through an economic contraction. Again, the Financial Times, for which the finance minister once worked, it said, quote, Canada's per capita gross domestic product has been shrinking 0.4% a year since 2020, the worst rate for any developed economy in the top 50. Does the government agree that Canada's per capita GDP is shrinking at the worst rate of any of the top 50 economies?
Here. MP Chong's really good.
The Honourable Deputy Prime
really
Minister and Minister of
stuff.
Finance.
Mr. Speaker, our government knows that what matters to Canadians is inflation. And that is why it is so important that inflation was 2% in August and that it has been within the Bank of Canada's target range all of this year. And it is because of that progress that interest rates in Canada have come down 3 times. That is real relief to homeowners. That is real relief to businesses. That is real relief to anyone who wants to buy a home. But all the Conservatives know how to do is talk Canada down.
That's right.
And I ask the honourable member from Dufferin Caledon, please, to hold his time until he has the floor, which he often does during question period. The honourable member from Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, the government loves to tout its economic record, but the results are simply underwhelming. Canada has the worst housing inflation among its peers, the worst performance in per capita income among the G7, gross fixed capital formation has not increased in a decade, and R&D spending as a percent of GDP is at its lowest point in 20 years. It's no wonder why young Canadians and businesses are packing up in search of better economic opportunities and higher standards of living. When will the government admit that its economic policies are putting the future of Canada at risk?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
You know, Mr. Speaker, what I find so interesting about these Conservatives is the only thing they know how to do is talk Canada down. A couple of months ago, the only thing they wanted to talk about was inflation. But guess what? We have good news on inflation. And with that good news on inflation comes good news on interest rates. On this side of the House, we celebrate good news for Canada and Canadians. On that side of the House, all they want to do is break things and cut.
The honourable member from Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not surprised the minister is not persuaded by my comments, but perhaps you might listen to economist Trevor Tombe, who said if Canada had simply kept pace with the U.S. over the past 2 years, our economy would be 8.5% larger. That's $6,200 per person richer we would be. Wow. Trevor Tombe says that is an incentive for Canadians and businesses to move south of the border in search of greater economic opportunities and higher standards of living. Mr. Speaker, when the Deputy Prime Minister says that her economic plan is working, is this what she means?
Yeah. The Honourable Minister for Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, we're even better than that, Mr. Speaker. We've attracted $60 billion of investment in this country, Mr. Speaker. Even Bloomberg put Canada ahead of China for the battery ecosystem in this country, Mr. Speaker. We have the talent, we have the ecosystem, we have the critical mineral, we have the renewable energy, we have the access to market. Let's talk about possibility, let's talk about opportunities, let's talk about Canada of the 21st century, Mr. Speaker. Let's be...
Holy crap, he's blowing a gasket. he always yells.
Colleagues, as we know, question period is of a limited time. I've been reminded that many times. I've allowed it to go on, but if we have to interrupt all the time, we might get to the point where we might need to end a question due to the heckling. So I'll ask the honourable members to please not do so.
The honourable member for Mégantic-l'Érable. Mr. Speaker, it is high time to put an end to this bloc-backed Liberal government's economic vandalism. Under this Prime Minister, Canada has recorded the worst per capita income growth, or GDP, than under any other Prime Minister since 1930. In fact, Canada has experienced the worst income growth in the G7 since 2015, down 2% in Canada and up 8% in the United States. This means lower standard of living for all Canadians, including seniors who no longer have enough money to pay their rent and bills. When will this Liberal bloc think of seniors and stop its economic vandalism? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, I've noticed something very interesting coming from the Conservative side of this House. A few months ago, the only word in the Conservatives' vocabulary seemed to be inflation. But today, we have good news about inflation. In August, inflation was at 2%. And Mr. Speaker, all throughout this year, inflation has been in the Bank of Canada's target range. Mr. Speaker, that's good news for Canada and for Canadians. But all Conservatives seem to be interested in is the bad news. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Well, let's talk about the target range, Mr. Speaker. Seniors, Canadians in general, they're no longer able to put food on the table. Why? Because the cost of housing has increased, the cost of food has increased, the cost of everything is up because of this Bloc-supported Liberal government and their decision-making. You know, seniors built Canada and they lived in a Canada that rewarded those who worked hard. Why does the Bloc-backed Liberal Party want to continue to vandalize seniors' pensions by raising taxes again and again? I ask the Honourable Member for La Prairie to not speak before being recognized. The Honourable Minister of Innovation, Science and Technology. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we do indeed respect seniors. That's why we've always been there for seniors. But seniors understand, Mr. Speaker, that we also need to invest in the future. Canadians know that. They understand it. That's why we are attracting generational investments. For instance, Moderna, which set up shop in Laval, or in Bécancour, another huge investment. We want to put Quebec at the forefront of the automobile industry of the 21st century. And people will say to us, thank you. And we thank our workers, and they can count on us to build the Canada of tomorrow and the Canada of the 21st century. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Shefford. The Bloc Québécois is using October 29th as a deadline to be an ultimatum on behalf of seniors. Today, seniors' representatives are here in Ottawa to support our initiative. The FADOC is here, as well as its Mauricie chapter. The AQDR is here. The Outaouais, AQRP, and AREQ are here. The Table de Concertation des Aînés des Laurentides is here. They're all here to demand that we put an end to discrimination against seniors and to demand that we increase OAS by 10% for those 74 and under. They expect a clear answer. Will the government give C319 a royal recommendation? The Honourable Minister of Labour and Seniors. Mr. Speaker, I take great pleasure in calling out the Bloc Québécois for its hypocrisy. The member for Shefford, you know, there are 13,300 people in the riding of Shefford eligible for dental care. These people are saving hundreds upon hundreds of dollars thanks to dental care. But the member for Shefford, she voted against dental care for vulnerable seniors in Quebec. That's shameful, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Shefford. If what the minister is saying were enough, then the FADOC, the AQDR, and the ATDR and several other groups would not be in Ottawa today, and yet they are here today. They're here demanding a 10% increase in old age security for those 74 and under. All seniors deserve the same support as they're all facing the same rising cost of living. Everyone seems to understand that. Seniors do not deserve to be divided into two classes of citizens. It's high time that the Liberals put an end to their age-based discrimination. Will they give C319 a royal recommendation? The Honourable Minister of Seniors and Labour. Mr. Speaker, no party in this House has done as much for seniors in Canada and in Quebec as the Liberal Party of Canada. Despite the opposition of the Conservative Party, the opposition of the Bloc Québécois, because they voted against dental care. They voted against the guaranteed income supplement. They voted against additional housing for vulnerable seniors. But dental care, Mr. Speaker, the Bloc Québécois voted against all of that I just listed. Now they're accusing us of not supporting seniors. The Bloc Québécois should apologize to seniors and to us.
It's actually good today.
Just a moment, please.
Juste pour vous rappeler, je suis très content de reconnaître l'honorable député.
I'm very happy to recognize the honourable member for Shefford for a third time, but I would encourage her to not speak before recognized by the chair. The honourable member for Shefford. Today is International Day of Older Persons, and on this day, the Bloc Québécois would like to highlight the work of community organizations that support retirees. It is inexcusable that some should be deprived of funding under the Age Well at Home program. It is inexcusable that the government is starving our organizations and depriving Quebec seniors of money and services that are rightfully theirs. It's inexcusable that the federal government is getting into a jurisdictional tiff with Quebec at the expense of seniors. Will the federal government finally transfer Quebec its share of funding and stop holding seniors hostage?
Just give us more money. That's all the Bloc ever wants. Just give me more money.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Seniors. Mr. Speaker, we are especially proud of the pilot project, Age Well at Home. That is among our government's priorities. We want seniors to age at home and to age independently and live independently. We have unblocked funding for all provinces. We have sent funding to all provinces. The government of Quebec, though, they need to do their part, and then they will get funding. Organizations like Centre Bénévole and Chez Christo Pop in Montreal will then receive their funding. Mr. Speaker.
From Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes.
In the latest conflict of interest from a government of serial ethical lawbreakers, the Prime Minister wants his buddy Mark Carbon Tax Carney's company to be in charge of $10 billion of Canadians' pension dollars. Now, he doesn't want him to be subjected to any of the conflict of interest rules. All the power, all the money, none of the accountability. After 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, taxes are up, costs are up, crime is up, and time is up for Carbon Tax Carney and this Prime Minister. Why don't they just call a carbon tax election?
Here, here. Oh, no, not in.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Another week, another tired line from the Conservatives. When it comes to Canadians who disagree with their vision of the country, instead of allowing for that disagreement to happen, they attack them personally and try to bring them down. We have seen this time and time again from Conservatives, whether it's the news media like CBC or CTV, or whether it's eminent Canadians who give of themselves. The Conservatives only have one objective, and that's to tear down Canadians who don't share their beliefs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, and Rideau Lakes.
It's no surprise that that member wants to deflect from her Prime Minister, who was twice found guilty of breaking ethics laws himself, and that's why he's trying to protect his buddy Carbon Tax Carney from the ethical rules that would, of course, call into question this $10 billion of Canadians' pensions that they want to let him get his hands on in exchange for what? Advice that he's going to give them from Bay Street that everyone on Main Street can just eat cake when they can't afford any more of his rising carbon tax. It's been 9 years of their failed NDP Liberal policies. Canadians are out of money. They're out of time. When can we have an election?
Here, here.
Before the Honourable Minister takes her spot, I did hear a comment out of turn. I think it was from a minister. I couldn't figure out who it is, but I'll ask members to please, again, don't take the floor unless recognized by the chair. The Honourable Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, what we see from the Conservative members of Parliament is that they just can't handle being criticized. It's the same way they treat the media. When the media asks them tough questions about what they are putting forward in terms of their agenda for Canadians, what do? They attack them. This is what they do with the media. This is what they do with eminent Canadians. This is what they do with any Canadian who doesn't share the vision for Canada. Mr. Speaker, we should be talking up Canada. We should be talking up Canadians instead of talking them down like the Conservatives.
Yeah, good answer.
The Honourable Member from Calgary Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, first the Liberals announced that Mark Carney, the chair of Brookfield, a $1 trillion corporation whose interests span the entire federal government, would be setting Canada's economic policy. Then news broke that Brookfield had been lobbying for a federally funded multi-billion-dollar investment fund that they would manage. Then, over this past weekend, Mark Carney sent out a fundraising email blast via the Liberal Party's donation list. Interesting. Did the Liberals or Brookfield clear any of this with the lobbying commissioner?
That's a good question.
The Honourable Leader of the Government in the House of Commons.
Again, again, Mr. Speaker, what we see from the Conservatives is when there are Canadians that don't share their vision of Canada, they talk them down. They try.
Invite the Honourable Minister to start again, but I'm going to ask members, please, again, do not take the floor until they're recognized by the Chair. The Honourable Leader of the Government from the House of Commons from the top.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's okay. I understand this response makes them uncomfortable because they know it's true, Mr. Speaker. Right. But when it comes to Canadians who don't share their vision of Canada, what do Conservative members of Parliament do? They talk them down. They try to bring them down. They don't like having people push against their agenda. They don't like it when they're asked tough questions, or when smart, intelligent people don't share their vision of Canada, they try to take them down instead of having that debate. Thank you.
That's right. Good answer.
Oh my God, everyone, shut up.
The Honourable Member from Calgary Nose Hill.
Grifols, a big pharma company, recently gained approval from Canadian Blood Services, which is regulated by the Liberal government, to acquire Canadian plasma resources, a critical source of blood products for Canadians. But this summer, reports said that under this contract, Canadian blood plasma products could be sold abroad for profit by Grifols, something that could jeopardize supply in Canada. Guess which company has been in takeover talks with Grifols this whole time? Brookfield. Is that why the Liberals didn't clear Carney with the lobbying commissioner?
Wow. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, Canada is known everywhere in the world as being absolutely one of the best jurisdictions to manage blood supply, and that is something that we are absolutely committed to continuing. I think that casting aspersions and trying to manufacture things is something we're used to on the other side, but that reputation that we've won hard-earned to make sure that when Canadians need blood that it's there for them and it's there for them safely is something that we're going to continue unabated to be committed to.
I'm going to ask the Honourable Member from St. Margaret's South Shore, please, to he's been keeping his voice down, but it's been regular, so I'm just going to ask him to please not do that. The Honourable Member from Ladysmith, Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Mr. Speaker, residential school survivors and their families deserve answers. We know that truth comes before healing. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls on all levels of government and churches to hand over all records. But survivors still face barriers, missing records, delays, and disappointments. Why is this government failing to give survivors and their families access to the truth?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for that very important question. And let me take this opportunity to acknowledge the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation and the many commemorations that took place across this country. From 2015, when the Truth and Reconciliation Report calls to action came in to government, we've been working towards enacting all the 94 calls to action. We will continue to work with survivors in order to ensure that there is truth, justice, and accountability, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable Member from Edmonton, Griesbach.
The housing crisis in Edmonton rages on, and Indigenous people are disproportionately impacted. Latest reports show that Edmonton's homeless population has jumped by 1,300 people since the start of the year. To make matters worse, last winter's amputations due to frostbite skyrocketed by 162%. With colder temperatures approaching, people are going to lose limbs or die. Will the Liberals continue to stand by and watch alongside Danielle Smith, or will they finally build the homes people in Edmonton desperately need?
Yeah, it's pretty cold in Northern Alberta.
The Honourable Minister for Indigenous Services.
Mr. Speaker, after a decade of nothing happening under the previous Conservative government, we launched the National Housing Strategy. And, Mr. Speaker, we've been working with communities, with First Nations leaders, with Indigenous organizations to ensure that people have access to the kinds of housing that they need. We're not going to stop, Mr. Speaker, until every person in this country knows that there is someplace they can turn as winter approaches.
The Honourable Member from Winnipeg South Centre.
Mr. Speaker, September 30th marks one of the most important days in the Canadian calendar.
For generations, Indigenous peoples had to conceal their cultures, languages, and true identities. The results, both past and present, led to the devastating consequences faced by families and communities and gave way to intergenerational trauma, the impacts of which is still felt immensely in our country today. Yesterday, communities across Canada came together to honor survivors and their relatives and commit to doing our part on this journey towards truth and reconciliation. I ask the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations to share his reflections with the House on the importance of this day and the work ahead. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me begin by acknowledging the work of my friend from Winnipeg. Yesterday was National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and over the last several days, I've had the opportunity to listen to many survivors, Mr. Speaker, who speak about the enormous loss that they feel. I also have had a chance to speak to many who've been working towards advocating towards finding truth for the loved ones that never came home. This afternoon, we raised the survivors' flag right here on the Hill, and I ask all Canadians to reflect on this day and to ensure that they do their part towards reconciliation.
The Honourable Member from Thornhill.
After 9 years of this Liberal NDP costly coalition, grocery prices are up 27%, gas prices are up 40%, and now new data from Equifax shows that credit card debt is up too. The average Canadian now has $4,300 on their credit card, the highest on record since the last recession. Why are these Liberals using their carbon tax to inflate the price of everything, punishing families and forcing them to take on more debt just to get by?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I am really glad to have the chance to talk about our carbon rebates and our policies on credit cards, because today we announced that later this month, thanks to our government's negotiations with credit card companies, the fees that small businesses have to pay are going down. That is good news for small businesses across the country. And you know what else is good news? Small businesses are going to get big carbon rebates. That member of Parliament, like me as an Ontario MP, an Ontario business with 10 employees is going to be getting
The Honourable Member from Thornhill.
Speaker, this might be the only person left in the world that thinks paying more tax makes you richer and somehow stops climate change. The carbon tax isn't about the environment, and it's certainly not about affordability. It's about getting more money for her spending addiction. Even Catherine McKenna admits that their plan was always to spend your money. It's clear that they've run out of money. They're going to raise the tax over and over again to 61 cents a litre as 2 million people use a food bank. How many more people will face poverty before they reverse course?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I will give them a number: 69 million cars in avoided pollution. That's our number, Mr. Speaker. That's my number. That's our number on this side of the House. If we listened to them, we would do nothing to fight climate change. Pollution would be even worse. Emissions would be 41% higher than what we've been doing. We're working to fight climate change. We're working to support Canadians, to create the economy of the 21st century. They have nothing to offer, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Foothills.
The NDP Liberals are desperately trying to convince Canadians that they're better off paying a higher and higher carbon tax. But the truth hurts. It appears that food inflation isn't a global issue, it's an NDP Liberal issue. Right. According to the food professor, because of the carbon tax, wholesale food prices in Canada are up 34% in every single category. And wholesale food prices in Canada are 37% higher than they are in the United States. Again, because of the carbon tax. Exactly. Will the Prime Minister just admit he was wrong about his carbon tax and call a carbon tax election? Let's go.
The Honourable Minister for the Environment and Climate Change.
Mr. Speaker, it seems that Conservatives are now starting to listen to economists, and they quoted Trevor Toombs. Well, let's say what Trevor Toombs has to say about carbon pricing and price on food, Mr. Speaker. And I quote, "While concern around affordability is clearly warranted, climate policies are not a significant driver of the rising cost of living, nor will removing policies such as carbon pricing materially improve the situation." Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable from Foothills.
The NDP Liberals just can't handle the truth. And the truth is Canadians are being forced to food banks in record numbers. And even the Liberal member from Winnipeg North said when you attribute the increase in food prices of 34% to the carbon tax, that's absurd. But the food professor's own data shows the Liberals are wrong. That's right. What is absurd is increasing the carbon tax when 9 million Canadians don't know when their next meal is coming from. Exactly. Will the Prime Minister admit their tax plan is this carbon tax, call a carbon tax election so Canadians could put food on the table?
Exactly. The Honourable Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And being a farmer myself, I know what it's like for farmers to be on the front line of climate change. Our farmers face devastating storms like Hurricane Fiona, which tore down barns, killed cattle. We have floods, fires right across the country. This is the reason, one of the reasons why food prices are so high. We put a price on pollution that works, Mr. Speaker. And also, my honourable colleague, in his riding, his average farmer will receive $1,800 a year in carbon rebate. I know the Conservative Party...
The honourable member for Torres-de-Blainville.
Sit down.
We just had 2 questions, can have more questions if they could work that out with the leadership, but not at this time. But I'll be happy to recognize the honourable member when he stands up on his feet when it is time for the people from his political formation to get a question. Alors.
Order. The honourable member for Torres-de-Blainville. The cost of living affects all seniors. There aren't 2 grocery bills, one for those 65 to 74 years old and another for older seniors. There are no age discounts on housing, nor are there any specials for clothing or medication. And yet, people aged 65 to 74 receive 10% less old age security. Everyone understands that this is unfair. So will the Liberals put an end to this injustice? Or will we get on the bus and hit the election trail? The Honourable Minister of Employment and Seniors. Mr. Speaker, the member for Torres-de-Blainville, when she had the opportunity to allow seniors to save hundreds of dollars, seniors who are vulnerable, we're talking about 7,300 vulnerable seniors in her own riding. Well, she voted against that opportunity. It's hypocritical. And now she wants to lecture us about these opportunistic policies. No, we are here for Canadians. We are supporting them, and it's the Bloc. And this is the first question for the member from La Salle-et-Mare-Verdun. Mr. Speaker, I would like to take this first opportunity to thank the citizens of Les Salles-et-Mare-Verdun for their trust. I will do my utmost to deserve it. Today, I am proud to join the Bloc Québécois ultimatum for seniors. The Liberals have 2 choices. They can improve OAS for those under 74 years of age and under, or they can go to the polls right now. And I am in a good position to remind them that the last time around it didn't end very well for them. So what will they choose, seniors or an election?
I have no idea why he's yelling. He just got in the House, and he's reading off a pre-written thing from his party leader.
For the second time today, I would ask the member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier, please to not speak when someone else is. The Honourable Minister of Employment and Seniors. Mr. Speaker, I would like to welcome that member to this chamber and I'd like to reassure him that I heard him very well, even though he was very far from power that as he will be throughout his stay here. But, Mr. Speaker, our government spends more on OAS to protect seniors than other previous governments have. And for my colleague, 71 seniors, the seniors receive more thanks to the Liberal government.
Member from Fundy Royal.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, taxes are up, costs are up, crime is up, and time is up. This government is forcing families to pay more for gas, for groceries, for home heating, at a time when they can least afford it. Now the province of New Brunswick is taking the Liberals to court to hold them accountable for the money their carbon tax is making off the backs of everyday Canadians. Will this government listen to Canadians, scrap their carbon tax, or will they finally let Canadians choose in a carbon tax election?
The Honourable Minister for the Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps the member opposite can remind the Premier of New Brunswick and some of his members of his own bench that they asked Premier Higgs to go with the federal system because people get more money back, and that's exactly what the Premier did. The Premier of New Brunswick decided to go for the federal system because more people in New Brunswick get more money back than what they pay in carbon pricing, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Fundy Royal.
Mr. Speaker, we know the Liberals would rather talk about anything else than talk about the fact that their 61-cent per litre carbon tax will mean that Canadians will have amongst the highest fuel prices in the world. Even the Parliamentary Budget Officer has confirmed that the Liberals' carbon tax costs Canadians more than they get back. Canadians have no confidence in this Prime Minister or in his costly carbon tax. When will the Liberal government get out of the way that so Conservatives can finally axe the tax?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources and Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is very clear that the vast majority of Canadian families get more money back than they pay. That has been validated by 300 economists, very much, including Trevor Toombs, who they like to quote these days as an economist of record. But I would say not having a climate plan and not having an economic plan for the future will have dire implications for the people who live in Atlantic Canada. These folks oppose the Atlantic Accords, the work that's being done to actually launch an offshore wind and a hydrogen industry to ensure that we are creating good jobs and economic opportunities in Atlantic Canada. They have no plan for climate. They have no plan for the economy.
That's all that guy ever says.
The Honourable Member from New Brunswick Southwest.
Mr. Speaker, after 9 years of NDP Liberals, taxes up, costs up, crimes up, and time's up for this costly coalition's carbon tax scam. 9 premiers are now against the Liberal carbon tax. Today in New Brunswick, Premier Blaine Higgs is challenging this scam in court. Provinces don't get a rebate for heating schools and fueling ambulances. Carbon taxes are not revenue neutral when provinces and municipalities end up paying more for essential services. When will the Green Liberal NDP coalition axe the tax or keep making health care and education more expensive?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change.
Mr. Speaker, perhaps the member opposite doesn't remember that he himself asked Premier Higgs to go with the federal system so that more people in New Brunswick would get more money back than what they pay in carbon pricing. Perhaps he forgot that he made himself that request to his Premier, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Lac Saint Louis. Mr. Speaker, in Quebec and across Canada, we are facing a housing crisis that is affecting the lives of people across the country. We need to build more housing and quicker to give Quebecers and Canadians access to housing that meets their needs and is affordable. Can the Minister of Public Works explain to the citizens of my riding of Lac Saint Louis how our government will enable the creation of affordable housing across the country? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. 6 housing units is what the Conservatives built throughout their term with Mr. And then now they're saying that it was a type of communism to build affordable housing on federal funding, including for seniors. Communism. The good news that we've just built 250,000 housing units. The honourable member for Chicoutimi.
That guy has had the same talking point for probably
Speaker,
6 months.
Forestry workers in Quebec in some 30 communities are being affected. It is a catastrophe. Out of 1,400 jobs, at least, are being affected and is affecting Quebec's economy. The Bloc is once again voted to keep the government in place, and this is how we realize that they're disconnected from the reality of our regions. Is the Bloc aware of the extent of the disaster that the minister's decree has had in Quebec? The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind my colleague that we put $500 million of potential investment on the table in Quebec and the regions and in the forestry workers and for workers in that sector. And we're only waiting for the Quebec government to sit down at the table with us to discuss things. We want to find a solution, but the Conservatives don't want to do anything for the economy or jobs. The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, the Quebec Minister of the Environment is in Ottawa today, and he doesn't understand anything, as do all Quebecers, because our workers are now out of jobs. He wants Quebec to be able to take action in its jurisdiction. The Bloc says it defends Quebec's jurisdiction, but it's very visible on this file. Can the government finally understand that this decree is a catastrophe we could have foreseen? The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind once again my colleague that at the end of 2022, we signed a joint letter with the federal government, well, between the federal government and the Quebec government, asking Quebec to present a plan for the reestablishment of the woodland caribou. But now it's 2024 and we're still waiting for this plan. All we're asking is for Quebec to do what it committed to do, and we're ready to work with them to find solutions. The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, like the Prime Minister, the Bloc leader likes to entertain us with imaginary tales to try to justify his relevance in Ottawa. He sells himself as the hero who puts the brakes on the moratorium on logging in Abitibi, Côte-Nord, and Lac-Saint-Jean regions. But the reality is that Quebec's Minister of the Environment, Benoit Charette, is that the Liberal Prime Minister and his Minister of the Environment literally want to shut down this economic engine of Quebec's regions without even visiting them. Once again, will Canada's Environment Minister put a definitive stop to this radical decree? The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. Mr. Speaker, experts, ecologists, forestry workers, and First Nations all say that the future of the forestry industry in Quebec and in our country depends on the health of our forests and also on the health of the caribou. You can't have one without the other. The only people who don't understand that here is the Conservative Party.
The Honourable Member from St. John's East.
Mr. Speaker, today is National Seniors Day, a day to celebrate and thank seniors across the country. Our government knows the importance of promoting the health and well-being of seniors, and that is why we make investments towards programs and services for them. Can the Minister of Health update Canadians on what we are doing to protect and support the health of seniors across this country?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Be allowed to ask
thank you very much, Mr.
questions
Speaker, and I want to thank the member
period.
for St. John's East for her tireless advocacy and really championing the health of seniors in this country. You know, I look at just Newfoundland and Labrador, one of 13 agreements signed in every jurisdiction in the country on aging with dignity, helping seniors to age at home and improve our long-term care facilities. And critically, Mr. Speaker, those agreements include for the first time common indicators so we can see that progress in data and see how provinces are doing. Obviously, the work to ensure hundreds of thousands of seniors get dental care, as well as what we're doing in pharmacare, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Courtenay, Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, the New Chalmette Tribal Council has declared a state of emergency in every single one of their 14 nations territories. The lack of mental health support, treatment, recovery, and harm reduction services is causing irreparable harm. This Liberal government has failed to deliver the urgently needed supports, and young and older people are paying the price. Indigenous people continue to die at a higher rate than non-Indigenous people. This isn't reconciliation. Action is needed now. When will the Liberals stop with the empty words and deliver the urgent funding that the New Chalmette people need to save lives?
The Honourable Minister for Indigenous Services.
Mr. Speaker, that's exactly the path that our government has been on, working hand in hand with First Nations and with Indigenous leaders to ensure that programs and services that are delivered by First Nations and Indigenous people are available to their members so that people can heal from the trauma of colonization, Mr. Speaker, something that just yesterday our government stood up with many survivors across the country to acknowledge. This has deep impacts on communities, and we'll continue this hard work together.
The honourable member from Churchill, Kiwatanuk-Aski.
Mr. Speaker, Liberals spent yesterday professing support for First Nations, the same First Nations the government is currently fighting in court over something as basic as clean drinking water. Canada's lawyers are saying that, quote, Canada doesn't know any legal obligations or duties to operate First Nations water systems. They even say that when ministers make promises, it's just, quote, context-specific and can be ignored. This is the Liberal approach to reconciliation. Promise clean drinking water to First Nations and then direct your lawyers to fight First Nations in court on clean drinking water. Will the Liberals cut the hypocrisy, stop fighting Shamattawa and other First Nations in court, and deliver clean drinking water once and for all?
The Honourable Minister for Indigenous Services.
Mr. Speaker, it's really heartening to hear the Member of Parliament from the NDP speak so eloquently about the need to move quicker and faster on alleviating long-term boil water advisories across this country. In fact, since we've taken office, we've lifted over 145 long-term boil water advisories, prevented well over 200, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue that hard work. I assume from her comments that means she's going to support this new legislation and ensure it has safe passage through the House.
I'd like to thank honourable members for carrying themselves out largely without issue today.
Question period's wrapping up here.
The honourable member from Caribou, Thompson, Kamloops Thompson Caribou is rising on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had a member statement under Standing Order 31 today. That statement had to be delivered twice, and it was to salute two veterans, one who's 101 and one who's 104 in my riding. And both times there was quite a bit of noise in the chamber for what I'd hoped to be a very solemn salute to these two living veterans who lived through D-Day. I would just bring this to the chair's attention in hopes that, especially when people are giving heartfelt member statements like this one to our veterans, that there could be a bit more quiet. Thank you.
I thought he said it twice, but I guess he was talking
about the honourable member for raising this issue, and it's an important point of the importance of Standing Order 31. So I'd encourage all members. I know it's usually the time that some members are coming from committee and entering into the House to try to take their seats quietly so that members can get their declarations off appropriately so that they could share these important issues and this important time with their constituents. It being 3:21, the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division of the motion of Mr. Berthold relating to the business of supply. Comme il est 15h20, la Chambre procédera mais...
It being 3:20, the House will now proceed to the taking of the deferred recorded division on the motion of Mr. Berthold relating to the business of supply. Call in the members.
Okay, so I think they have a business of supply first, if that's what they're talking about. Yeah, okay. So this was from this morning. I don't know what the bloc was asking for, but after this vote will be the vote for the non-confidence motion. Oh, wait, no, that's what they're voting on now? Because they just changed it. So are they not getting to the... What the heck is going on today, Dad? They don't even know what they're doing. What is going on?
Are all honourable members taking their seats? The question is as follows. La question est la suivante, plutôt.
The question is as follows. Mr. Berthold, seconded by Mr. Albus, moved that, given that, after 9 years, the government has doubled housing costs, taxed food, punished work, unleashed crime, and is the most centralizing government in Canadian history, the House has lost confidence in the government and offers Canadians the option to axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime.
La période de 10 minutes pour les députés.
The 10-minute period for members voting electronically has started.
Okay, perfect. Here we go.
The House will now proceed to the vote for members participating in person. All those in favor of the motion will please rise.
Mr. Poilievre.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Williams. Mr. Perkins. Mr. Brock.
Mr. Brock.
Mr. Deltel.
Mr. Deltel.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mr. Polis.
Mr. Polis.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Upal.
Mr. Upal.
Ms. Lantzman.
Ms. Lantzman.
Miss Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Ms. Lewis Haldeman Norfolk.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Gray.
Mrs. Gray.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Baldinelli.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Jennis.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Small.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Duncan Stormont Dundas South Glengarry.
Mr. Duncan Stormadungas, South Glengarry.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Chong.
Mr. Abultayev.
Mr. Abultayev.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mrs. Kuzi.
Mr. Seaback.
Mr. Seaback.
Ms. Ferrari.
Ms. Ferrari.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mr. Stewart Miramichi, Clarence Lake.
Mr. Stewart Miramichi, Grand Lake.
Mr. Chambers.
Mr. Chambers.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Viss.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. McCully, Edmonton West.
Mr. McCollum, Edmonton West.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Lloyd.
Mr. Strahl.
Mr. Strahl.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mrs. Goodridge.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Moore.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Aitchison.
Mr. Godin.
Mr. Godin.
Mr. Holback.
Mr. Holback.
Mr. Moran.
Mr. Morantz.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mrs. Roberts.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Malillo.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Ms. Gladue.
Ms. Gladue.
Mr. Khanna.
Mr. Khanna.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Mrs. Cramp-Nyman.
Madame Vien.
Madame Vien.
Mr. Patzer.
Mr. Patzer.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mrs. Gallant.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Shipley.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Muse.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Redicott.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Van Popta.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Steinley.
Mr. Calkins.
Mr. Calkins.
Ms. Rude.
Ms. Rude.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Lehoux.
Monsieur Généreux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Mazer.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Davidson.
Mr. Martel.
Mr. Martel.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Caputo.
Mr. Epp.
Mr. Epp.
Ms. Rempel Garner.
Ms. Rempel Garner.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Majumdar.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Cram.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mr. Tolmie.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Bragdon.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Allison.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford, Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford, Lloydminster.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Reed.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Falk Provencher.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Mott.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Williamson.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. D'Entremont.
Monsieur D'Entremont.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Morrison.
Mr. Soroka.
Mr. Soroka.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Vidal.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Dowdle.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Vierson.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Giovanni.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto, St. Paul's.
Mr. Stewart, Toronto, St. Paul's.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Mr. Macaulay Cardigan.
Mr. Macaulay Cardigan.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. Blair.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Holland.
Ms. Ing.
Ms. Ing.
Monsieur Duclos.
Monsieur Duclos.
Ms. Freeland.
Ms. Freeland.
Monsieur Champagne.
Monsieur Champagne.
Ms. Anand.
Ms. Anand.
Monsieur Guilbeault.
Monsieur Guilbeault.
Mr. Wilkinson.
Mr. Wilkinson.
Monsieur Boissonneau.
Mr. Boissonneau.
Ms.
Tassie.
Ms. Tassie.
Ms. Tassie.
Mr. Varani.
Mr. Varani.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Sachs.
Ms. Suds.
Ms. Suds.
Ms. Chagger.
Ms. Chagger.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. McKay.
Ms. Crow.
Ms. Crow.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Scarpalegia.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Casey.
Mr. Vandal.
Monsieur Vandal.
Ms. Cara.
Ms. Cara.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Madame Saint-Onge.
Ms. Haidu.
Ms. Haidu.
Mr. Miller.
Monsieur Miller.
Ms. Sahota.
Ms. Sahota.
Madame Joly.
Madame Joly.
Madame Leboutillier.
Madame Leboutillier.
Madame Bibot.
Madame Bibot.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Madame Petitpas-Taylor.
Mr. Hernandez Sangari.
Mr. Hernandez Sangari.
Madame Martinez Ferrada.
Madame Martinez Ferrada.
Ms. Jasic.
Ms. Jasic.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Arsenault.
Monsieur Arsenault.
Mr. Aria.
Mr. Aria.
Mrs. Romanato.
Mrs. Romanato.
Mr. Sheehan.
Mr. Sheehan.
Ms. O'Connell.
Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Oliphant.
Mr. Oliphant.
Madame Bendayan.
Madame Bendayan.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Madame Fortier.
Madame Fortier.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
Mr. Fragiscatos.
Mr. Biddle.
Mr. Biddle.
Ms. de Brusen.
Mr. Brusen.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Vancouverden.
Mr. Lauzon.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Mr. Kuzmarchek.
Mr. Kuzmarchek.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. May Cambridge.
Mr. Cormier.
Monsieur Cormier.
Ms. Dillon.
Ms. Dillon.
Ms. Derowitz.
Ms. Zerowitz.
Mr. Assassi.
Mr. Assassi.
Mr. El Khoury.
Monsieur El Khoury.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Fonseca.
Mr. Yacono.
Monsieur Yacono.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Johari.
Mr. Lightbound.
Monsieur Lightbound.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Cedar Brampton East.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Badaway.
Ms. DeMoss.
Ms. DeMoss.
Mr. Souza.
Mr. Souza.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Duguid.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mrs. Atwin.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Maloney.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Sarai.
Mr. Kellaway.
Mr. Kellaway.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
Mr. Sanson.
Monsieur Sanson.
Mr. Serré.
Monsieur Serré.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Koutrakis.
Madame Brière.
Madame Brière.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Fisher.
Mr. Long.
Mr. Long.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McDonald Avalon.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Mr. McKinnon Coquitlam Port Coquitlam.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Morrissey.
Mr. Robillard.
Mr. Robillard.
Mr. Shifke.
Mr. Shifke.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Ms. Cedar Brampton South.
Mr. Sarbara.
Mr. Sarbara.
Ms. Hefner.
Ms. Hefner.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Turnbull.
Mr. Chang.
Mr. Chang.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mrs. Zaid.
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Ms. Yip.
Ms. Yip.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Lewis Kitchener-Conestoga.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Pulowski.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Van Bynen.
Mr. Ali.
Mr. Ali.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Bradford.
Ms. Bradford.
Madame Diab.
Madame Diab.
Mr. Gahir.
Mr. Gahir.
Madame Lapointe.
Madame Lapointe.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. McDonald Malpeck.
Mr. Meow.
Mr. Meow.
Ms. Taylor Roy.
Ms. Taylor Roy.
Ms. Thompson.
Ms. Thompson.
Mr. Carr.
Mr. Carr.
Ms. Gainey.
Ms. Gainey.
Monsieur Sainte-Marie.
Monsieur Sainte-Marie.
Madame Gill.
Madame Gill.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Madame de Bellefeuille.
Monsieur Thériault.
Monsieur Thériault.
Madame Larouche.
Madame Larouche.
Monsieur Barcelot-Duval.
Monsieur Barcelot-Duval.
Madame Vignola.
Madame Vignola.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
Monsieur Savard-Tremblay.
Madame Saint-Clair-Desgagnés.
Madame Saint-Clair-Desgagnés.
Madame Chabot.
Madame Chabot.
Monsieur Desilets.
Monsieur Desilets.
Monsieur Sauvé.
Monsieur Sauvé.
Mr. Julian.
Mr. Julian.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. Matheson.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. McPherson.
Ms. Gazan.
Ms. Gazan.
Mr. McGregor.
Mr. McGregor.
Ms. Barron.
Ms. Barron.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Garrison.
Mr. Canning.
Mr. Canning.
De retour à Madame Desbiens.
Madame Desbiens.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Zarillo.
Ms. Kwan.
Ms. Kwan.
Mr. Morris.
Mr. Morris.
La Chambre attendra maintenant la fin de la période.
The House will now wait for the end of the electronic voting period before proceeding.
Like, I don't get it. If these people are all listening to their constituencies and listening to Canadians, Canadians are saying they want an election. This is what happens when I almost feel like Parliament is, when it was made and when all this stuff, like, you actually needed someone to, you didn't have social media, you didn't have cell phones, you didn't have things like that. You needed an actual person to go around to doors and represent the constituencies, go to Parliament, things like that. That system has changed now. You can reach hundreds of thousands of people, millions of Canadians over social media, over video, over phone calls, things like that. So I think the system also needs a little bit of a change, and you shouldn't be allowed to enter into coalitions when you're a minority government. I think that also goes against the rules of democracy. If the people have elected a government as a minority, they shouldn't be allowed to go in cahoots with another party in order to fulfill their agenda. It's just they should stick to a minority. It's an even lazier job now. Yeah, I kind of agree with that. Although they still have to listen to people, it's just a different way that they reach the people. Kind of what I'm trying to say is the old system, you needed to actually, talk to people in your local riding, go to Parliament and take their concerns there. Whereas you don't even need to, there's many MPs who don't even live in their riding. I know that's never been a rule, but they can just talk to their people over the phone. I don't know, I guess they do stuff over social media. I think you should have to live in your riding, but yeah, ban coalitions. I agree. I don't think you should be allowed to. It's so undemocratic. Like the old Westminster system was formed so long ago that that's what we still use, and I don't think it's necessarily as effective as it could be. I think there needs to be a look at the way our Westminster system is done, because, society's changed since then, so it's crazy. It's way too easy to become an MP. It depends. You do have to get in with a party. You can run independently, but nobody really elects independents. You become independent after you leave a party. Okay, so they're going to tally the votes here. Obviously, we know this isn't going to pass, just the way we saw the voting.
I wish to inform members that the electronic voting period has ended. If members were unable to vote due to technical difficulties, they may now use the raise hand function, and the chair will recognize them.
Mrs. Thomas.
Mrs. Thomas, yea pour.
Mr. Green.
That's a hard no.
Green, nay contre.
Le bureau va maintenant compiler les...
The table will now compile the results of the vote.
Yeas pour 121, 121. Nays contre 207, 207.
Je déclare la motion.
I declare the motion defeated.
Brutal. 121 to 207.
Je désire aviser la Chambre.
I wish to inform the House that earpiece volume will now be reset. Members using their earpiece at this time will have to readjust the volume.
The House of the volume of earpieces will now be reset. Members using their earpiece at this time will have to readjust the volume.
Okay.
Je désire informer la Chambre qu'en raison...
I wish to inform the House that due to the recorded division, government orders will be extended by 12 minutes.
It was announced in French, I know. Be live tomorrow for question period at the same time. I believe there's a committee I'm going to cover as well. There's no committees that I'm covering today, but I've taken clips out from a couple of the committees, and I'm going to post them on the channel here shortly, so do check back on the channel in a bit. There's some good committee clips that I didn't think we needed to go live for because there wasn't really that many exciting committees today. So I just basically have got the clips out for you guys, so that way you didn't have to be live with me for the whole 3 hours watching the committee that I didn't think was that exciting to watch anyway. So I've got the clips for you from MP Cooper and stuff like that. So
heckles coming from one side of the House could be heard.
Hold on, let's just hear
the
what
source of the comment was not immediately apparent to the chair, nor was it to the editors of debates, who attributed them to, quote, an honourable member, unquote. After question period, the member for Edmonton Griesbach rose on a point of order, claiming the comments were clearly homophobic and asking the chair to look into the matter. Several other members referred to the specific situation the following day, on Thursday, September 26, pressing the chair to rule on it. At some point, accusations were made directly toward the member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, who was suspected to have said the alleged words. Juste avant la période des questions, jeudi dernier,
just before question period, Thursday, the chair made a ruling on decorum and unparliamentary language. The chair will repeat one of the quotations used in that ruling, as indicated on page 624 of the House of Commons Procedures and Practice, 3rd edition, and I quote, "In dealing with unparliamentary language, the Speaker takes into account the tone, manner, and intention of the member speaking, the person to whom the words at issue were directed, the degree of provocation, and, most important, whether or not the remarks created disorder in the chamber." End of quote. The member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, rose and admitted to having made the statement in question, but explained the context in which it was made and also explained his intentions in making the statement. He maintained that his comment was meant to criticize government spending and that no slur was intended.
That are clearly meant to denigrate someone due to their sexual orientation or make insinuations about someone's sexual orientation would not be acceptable in the House. While the member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, has vigorously denied that this was his intent, and the chair is prepared to take him at his word, I would invite him to reflect upon how his comments could have been interpreted and to recognize that they provoked disorder. The situation underscores certain principles that should govern our actions in this chamber. First, the importance of not shouting out comments across the floor, and second, to avoid jokes that others would interpret as hurtful or offensive. We all have a responsibility to choose our words carefully. It is in this context that I will invite the member from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, to withdraw his remarks, and to do so at the earliest possible opportunity. I thank all members for their attention.
Ridiculous.
I am also now ready to rule on the point of order raised on September 27th, 2024 by the member for Edmonton Strathcona concerning an alleged personal insult made by the member for Calgary Heritage during a statement delivered pursuant to Standing Order 31. In her intervention, the member for Edmonton Strathcona alleged that the member from Calgary Heritage used a personal insult directed at the member for Burnaby South earlier that day in his statement. She noted that the chair had made a ruling recently about personal insults directed towards other members. She suggested that the member for Calgary Heritage should be asked to withdraw his comment and apologize.
As I indicated in my ruling of September 26, 2024, I remain very concerned about the tendency to use overly personal criticism and insults. I also concluded my ruling, found at page 25-926 of the debates, by inviting, and I quote, members to be more judicious in their choice of words and behaviour. If they are not, the chair will have no choice but to discipline these members who persist in their unparliamentary behaviour, unquote. The chair has reviewed the statement made by the member for Calgary Heritage and finds certain words indeed constituted a personal attack on the member for Burnaby South.
Calgary Heritage should have been aware that his words were problematic, as I had warned one of his colleagues a few days before during statements by members against using the exact same terms. As I've stated before, there are ways to make our point without resorting to personal insults. As a result, the member for Calgary Heritage will not be recognized until such time he withdraws his offending words. I thank all members for their attention.
Ridiculous. He's not even going to allow him to say anything in Parliament until he sends him a message saying, I apologize.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With respect to your first ruling, I'm not questioning it. However, I do have a question that I would like to raise in the House with respect to it, and that is the application of the sexual harassment policy of the House of Commons with respect to the way members are treated with each other. We have all taken extensive training in sexual harassment, and one of the key parts of that is that intent does not play in findings in those proceedings. It is how someone receives them that matters. That even though someone says they have no intent, so I would like the Speaker to reflect on that to see whether or not that workplace sexual harassment policy applies in the chamber or if it's just outside the chamber. It's a genuine question and you can take time. I don't know the answer to it because we sat in those many sessions with respect to sexual harassment training, and I think that was the hardest thing for me to get in my head was I might say something that I don't think causes offense. But if it's heard that way, then I need to own it. And I just don't know whether that actually applies in the House or not. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I thank the honourable member from Don Valley West for rising on this important distinction. I just want to make sure.
Okay. So yeah, I just wanted to catch those points of orders there because yeah, basically Greg's now told two more Conservatives that they have to withdraw, and we see nothing on the Liberal side. He doesn't care if Conservatives are called homophobic. I don't get that, but. Anyway, so I've got to work on a couple clips. I'm going to go do that right now. They're from committee today, and I'll put those out on the channel shortly. I did put out a few clips this morning already. There's already 2 on the channel, so if you guys want to go watch those right after this, you're welcome to do so. I'll be live for question period tomorrow at the same time. I'll probably be covering a few committees as well. I just got to double check on that, and I'll make a post on that on the channel in a bit on what time I'm going to be, what my schedule is for tomorrow. And yeah, that's it. I'm going to call this stream here so I can go work on those clips for you guys. And I know, Steve. I know. I hate to mute Sheer, but I know they're just going to be talking about the Speaker's ruling. So anyway, cheers, guys. I will see you tomorrow. And check back on the channel to make sure you watch those clips.